Murder in the Allotment Garden. Dear friends, a very warm good evening to you. I'm Edward, your host for tonight's gathering. It truly means the world to me to spend these quiet evening hours in your company, no matter where you are in this big, wide world. Do leave a little note in the comments letting us know where you're watching from. I so love to hear from each and every one of you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let the stillness of the evening wrap around you. Let us begin tonight's mystery together. Chapter 1. The Hook and Host Intro. The mist came in slowly over Little Wychwood that April morning. Not the sharp, purposeful mist of November that smells of wet coal and closed windows, but the soft, almost apologetic sort that gentles itself around the hedgerows and softens the edges of things, as though the village itself were reluctant to wake and face what the day had brought. It was the kind of morning that made one think of porridge left too long on the hob, and of cats that would not venture past the doorstep, and of old women who kept their curtains drawn until a decent hour, not out of laziness, but out of a lifetime's understanding that some things are best approached gradually. Murder in the Allotment Garden. Dear friends, a very warm good evening to you, and how truly lovely it is to spend these quiet hours in your company once again. I'm Edward, your host, and I find myself thinking, as I always do when we gather like this, of how remarkable it is that so many of us, scattered as we are across this big wide world, should find comfort in the same small particular things. A cup of something warm, a chair that knows the shape of you, and a story told without hurry. Before we begin, I do wonder, do you have a garden of your own, or perhaps a window box, or even just a favourite corner of a park that you think of as yours? Do leave us a note in the comments. I read everyone, and there's nothing I enjoy more on a quiet afternoon than imagining where all of you are, and what grows just outside your window. Now, to our story. The village of Little Wychwood sits in a fold of the Oxfordshire countryside, the sort of place that does not appear on any map of consequence and prefers it that way. It has a church of the perpendicular style with a clock that loses 4 minutes every fortnight, a post office that doubles as a lending library, a public house called the Crossed Keys which serves an adequate steak and kidney pie on Thursdays, and, of particular importance to us this evening, a stretch of communal allotment gardens running along the southern boundary of the churchyard wall. These allotments were, as such places always are in English villages, far more than mere plots of earth. They were a society in miniature. They had their hierarchies and their feuds, their unspoken rules and their whispered scandals. Old Mr. Trevithick, who had held Plot 7 for 31 years and grew runner beans of a quite extraordinary length, was regarded as a kind of unofficial patriarch. Mrs. Dolly Prentice of Plot 3 produced gooseberry preserves that had won the WE competition 4 years running, a fact she mentioned with a frequency that others found, in the privacy of their own kitchens, rather wearing. There was young Geoffrey Lamb, Gis, who had taken on Plot 12 only the previous autumn, and who planted things in the wrong season and didn't seem to care, which the older tenants found faintly alarming. And there was, or had been, until this particular April morning, Mr. Harold Cross of Plot 9. Mr. Cross was 57 years of age, a retired solicitor's clerk, a widower of 8 years, and a man of such precise and unvarying habit that the other allotment holders had been known to set their watches by the creak of his gate at 7:30 each morning. He grew shallots and leeks and a great deal of parsley. He wore the same waxed jacket regardless of temperature. He brought his own flask of tea and a tartan holder and drank it at 11 o'clock, standing up, looking northward, as though expecting something to arrive from that direction which never quite did. On the morning of the 12th of April, Mr. Cross's gate did not creak at 7:30, nor at 8. His flask was found on the potting table inside his shed, unfilled, and Mr. Harold Cross himself was discovered at 20 minutes past 9 by Mrs. Prentice, who had come to collect a trowel she had lent him in February and never quite forgotten about, lying quite still among his own rows of daffodils, his hat placed upright beside him on the earth, his hands folded with a neatness that no fall, however dignified, could have arranged. The flowers around him had been parted, not crushed. Sergeant Doyle of the Wychwood Constabulary arrived at 10 o'clock, looked at the body of Mr. Harold Cross, looked at his notebook, and wrote the words apparent cardiac episode in the careful and slightly laboured hand of a man who had learned early in his career that the simplest explanation was usually the right one. He was not, it must be said, an unintelligent man. But he was a busy one, and Little Wychwood was, after all, a quiet village. Miss Marple, who was staying with her niece on the other side of the churchyard wall, heard the ambulance depart. She set down her knitting. She was working on a pale blue bed jacket, the left sleeve giving her some trouble, and looked out of the parlour window for a long, thoughtful moment. "How very interesting," she said to no one in particular. "The parsley has not been watered." And she reached for her cardigan. Chapter 2. The Village and its Keeper. The churchyard wall that divided Miss Marple's niece's garden from the allotment plots was constructed of the local honey-coloured limestone, the sort that absorbs warmth in the afternoon and releases it slowly through the evening, so that if you pressed your palm flat against it at dusk it felt almost alive. Ivy had been growing along the eastern face of it for so long that it had become, in the collective opinion of Little Wychwood, structural, and any suggestion of its removal was met with the kind of quiet, implacable resistance that English villages reserve for their most deeply held convictions. Miss Marple had discovered, on her second morning, that a particular section of the wall near the old Lich gate had enough unevenness in its surface to allow a person of modest height and considerable determination to see quite clearly over it into the allotment beyond. She had not mentioned this to her niece Joan, who would have fussed. She had simply noted it, in the way that she noted most things, quietly, without drama, and with the particular attention of a woman who had learned that the world revealed its true nature only to those who took the trouble to look at it sideways. She was looking over the wall now, at 10:15 in the morning, her gardening gloves tucked into the pocket of her grey cardigan, her eyes moving slowly and methodically across plot 9. The daffodils were a good variety. King Alfred, she thought, the reliable old sort that nobody grew anymore, preferring the fancier Dutch hybrids. Mr. Cross had planted them in 3 straight rows along the western edge of his plot, precisely 18 inches apart. Miss Marple knew they were precisely 18 inches apart because she had counted the gaps, and because a man who kept his shallots in lines as true as ruled margin could not have done otherwise. What she was looking at now, however, was the parsley. It grew in a raised wooden bed against the shed wall, a robust dark-leaved variety, well established and obviously tended with care. But the soil around it was dry in a way that the soil on the rest of the plot was not. There had been a light overnight rain. She had heard it on the window glass at 3:30, and the open earth between the leek rows showed the characteristic darkening of freshly dampened ground. The parsley bed did not. It had a cover, she saw now, a sheet of old glass laid across the frame, but the glass had been removed and placed to one side, leaning against the shed, which meant the parsley should have received the night's rain perfectly well. The glass had been moved after the rain had stopped. "You'll catch your death leaning over that wall, Miss Marple," said a voice from below and to her left. She looked down. A woman of approximately 65 was standing on the allotment side of the wall, regarding her with the expression of someone who has caught a child doing something mildly transgressive and finds it more interesting than objectionable. She was stout, with the particular solidity of a woman who has spent decades on her feet, and she wore a canvas apron over her house dress with the strings tied in a firm double bow. Her hands were bare and soil dark, and she held a pair of secateurs loosely in her right hand the way a more theatrical person might hold a cigarette. "I'm quite warm, thank you," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "You must be Mrs. Prentice. I've heard a great deal about your gooseberry preserve." Mrs. Dolly Prentice's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the very slight adjustment of a person who is gratified and wishes not to appear so. "I didn't know Reverend Ashby's sister had a house guest. Joan is my niece, actually. I'm Jane Marple. I'm afraid I've been rather shamelessly observing your allotment from up here. I do hope you'll forgive me. I find I can't entirely help it. I was a great gardener once. Before my hip." This last detail was offered with the mild, self-deprecating sigh that Miss Marple had found, over many decades, to be extraordinarily effective at making people feel simultaneously sympathetic and superior, 2 conditions that, taken together, produced in most human beings an almost irresistible desire to talk. Mrs. Prentice, it turned out, was no exception. "It's a sad business," she said, glancing toward plot 9. "Harold Cross was a difficult man in some ways, particular, you know, the way men who've lived alone too long become particular. But he was reliable. You could set your clock by him. 31 years Mr. Trevithick's had his plot, but Harold was 22, and in all that time I don't believe he missed a single Tuesday. Tuesday being watering day for those of us on the southern run. The standpipe's shared, you see. There's a rota, Tuesday and Friday for plots 8 through 12. Harold was always first, 7:30 sharp before the sun got on the beds. She paused. Yesterday was Tuesday. And his parsley bed, said Miss Marple, with the gentle, slightly vague air of a woman making small talk. Was that always under glass? Mrs. Prentice looked at her rather sharply. Only in early spring. He'd have taken the frame off by now. He was particular about that. Said glass-grown parsley went soft. She frowned. Why do you ask? Oh, no reason at all, said Miss Marple. I'm afraid I'm frightfully interested in parsley. One of those small obsessions one develops. Do tell me, did you know Mr. Cross well? Beyond the allotment? I mean... There was a pause that lasted precisely long enough to be significant without being obvious. Mrs. Prentice looked at her secateurs, opened and closed them once, and said, As well as one knows any neighbour in a village this size. We were on the allotment committee together. He was the treasurer. That must have been a great responsibility. It was. Harold took it seriously. Some would say too seriously. Another pause, shorter this time. There had been a difficulty in the autumn. Some question about the accounts. Miss Marple's expression did not change. Her eyes, however, moved from the parsley bed to Mrs. Prentice's face with the quiet, unhurried precision of a woman threading a needle in poor light. These small committees, she said sympathetically, they do generate such feeling, don't they? Some, I think of our own Mothers' Union in St. Mary Mead. There was once a dispute over the flower rota that lasted the better part of 3 years and left 2 families not speaking at Christmas. Human nature, I'm afraid. Quite, said Mrs. Prentice, but she said it in the tone of a person who does not entirely agree and is choosing not to argue the point. And who else is on the committee, besides yourself and the late Mr. Cross? Geoffrey Lamb, though he only joined in October when Mr. Brierley retired, and Vera Stanton from Plot 4, and the chair is Mr. Neville Ashdown. He runs the hardware shop on the High Street. She said the last sentence with a flatness of tone that conveyed to a sufficiently attentive listener rather more than its literal content. Miss Marple stored this away with the careful, undemonstrative efficiency of a woman who has kept things in order all her life. Thank you so much, Mrs. Prentice, she said, beginning to ease herself back from the wall with a small, dignified wince that was perhaps 60% genuine. You've been terribly kind, and I do hope the gooseberries do well this year. I find the late frosts have been quite cruel to soft fruit. Mrs. Prentice watched her go with the expression of a woman who is not entirely certain what has just happened, but feels, obscurely, that she has said more than she intended to. She was correct. Back in Joan's parlour, Miss Marple settled into the armchair nearest the window, picked up her knitting, and did not knit. She looked at the ceiling for a moment with the pleasant, unfocused gaze of a woman thinking about nothing at all, which was, as those who knew her well could have confirmed, precisely what she looked like when she was thinking about a great deal. A difficulty with the accounts in autumn, a committee chair who ran a hardware shop, a parsley bed covered after the rain, a gate that did not creak at 7:30, and a hat placed upright beside a man who had fallen. She picked up the left sleeve of the bed jacket and began to count her stitches. He reminds me, she said quietly to herself, of poor Mr. Hodgson, the post office treasurer in St. Mary Mead. Such a very tidy man, and tidiness, I've always found, is either a great virtue or a very convincing performance of one. She was not, at this stage, entirely certain which it had been in the case of Mr. Harold Cross, but she was beginning to have thoughts. Chapter 3. The Body Among the Daffodils. The doctor came to see Joan at 11:30, which was not in itself unusual. Dr. Felix Haydock, a broad, unhurried man of 53 with the kind of face that inspired confidence in the elderly and mild terror in small children, had been the Wychwood practice's senior physician for nearly 2 decades, and he had the comfortable, well-worn quality of a piece of furniture that has found its proper room. He called on Joan regularly, ostensibly to check the progress of her autumn bronchitis, which had resolved itself satisfactorily in January, but which he continued to monitor out of a combination of professional thoroughness and the fact that Joan made exceptional shortbread. Miss Marple was in the parlour when he arrived, and she gave every appearance of being entirely absorbed in the left sleeve of her bed jacket, which had by now been unravelled and restarted twice, and was no closer to resolution. Miss Marple, said Dr. Haydock, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of a man who had sat in that particular chair before. Joan tells me you've been here a fortnight. I hope Little Wychwood is treating you gently." "Most gently," said Miss Marple, "though I confess this morning has been rather eventful. I heard the ambulance, of course, and Mrs. Prentice was kind enough to speak to me over the wall." She looked up from her knitting with the expression of a woman raising a very small and entirely innocent question. "Was it his heart, do you think, Doctor? You—" "A haydock." There was a pause of the particular kind that a careful observer would have noticed. Not the pause of a man gathering his thoughts, but the pause of a man deciding how many of them to share. "That would be the working assumption," he said. "Harold Cross had a history of mild arrhythmia. I'd been monitoring it for 3 years. His blood pressure was managed. He was on a low dose of digoxin. On the face of it, a cardiac episode is entirely consistent with his medical profile." "On the face of it," said Miss Marple pleasantly. Dr. Haydock looked at her for a moment. He had the expression of a man who has just recognised, slightly too late, that he has walked into an interesting conversation rather than a social call. "You have reservations," he said. "Oh, I wouldn't go as far as reservations," said Miss Marple. "Only small questions, the sort that probably mean nothing at all. The hat, for instance." The hat. Mr. Cross's hat. Mrs. Prentice mentioned it was placed upright beside him, on the earth, and the daffodils, she said they were parted around him, not crushed. I've been trying to imagine the mechanics of a man falling suddenly, from a cardiac episode, in the middle of his own flower rows. In my experience, and I have, I'm afraid, had rather more experience of such things than one would wish, a sudden fall is not a tidy business. The flowers would have been crushed. The hat would not have been upright. Dr. Haydock said nothing for a moment. Outside the window a blackbird was making its mid-morning inquiry of the garden, the same 4 notes repeated with the patient optimism of a creature that expects, eventually, an answer. The position of the body was— He stopped. Began again. He was on his back, arms at his sides, which is not the posture one expects of a man who has collapsed forward into a garden bed, and you're quite right about the daffodils. He said this last sentence in the tone of a man who has been trying, without entire success, not to think about something. I noted it. I mentioned it to Sergeant Doyle. And Sergeant Doyle said that the ground was soft and that Mr. Cross might have rolled, or been turned by whoever found him. He looked at the window. Mrs. Prentice found him, of course. She might have rearranged him instinctively in the shock of the moment. She might have, agreed Miss Marple. She strikes me as a very composed woman, however. Not the sort to rearrange instinctively. I'm more the sort to stand quite still and assess the situation before doing anything at all, she paused. But I may be wrong. I've only spoken to her once. You are very rarely wrong, I suspect, said Dr. Haydock, with something that was almost amusement. Even on the strength of a single conversation over a garden wall. Miss Marple smiled at her knitting. I've had a great deal of practice with garden walls. There was a companionable silence for a moment, of the kind that settles between 2 people who understand each other without requiring it to be stated. There is one other thing, said Dr. Haydock eventually in a different tone, quieter, more considered. I should not, strictly speaking, be saying this, but Harold's flask, the tartan one he always brought, was found in his shed, unfilled. He had not yet made his morning tea, which means he arrived at the allotment and went directly to his plot, without stopping at the shed first, said Miss Marple. That was not his habit, I take it. Never in 22 years, according to Mr. Trevithick, who has observed him from plot 7 every morning, Harold always went to the shed first, hung his jacket, filled his flask at the standpipe, checked his tools, then went to the plot. Always. Without variation. He paused. Someone, or something, drew him directly to the daffodil beds without allowing him his usual routine. Miss Marple set her knitting down slowly on her lap. Or he was placed there, she said, after the fact. The blackbird outside the window had gone quiet. I have asked for a full post-mortem, said Dr. Haydock. I affirm, break the bomb, in the careful tone of a man who has made a professional decision and is at peace with the personal discomfort it has caused him. I have cited the unexplained position of the body and a concern about a possible interaction with his medication. It will be conducted in Oxford, at the infirmary. Results in 4 to 6 days. That seems very wise, said Miss Marple. It also, he added, means that the allotment will remain a restricted area for the next several days, pending Sergeant Doyle's decision about whether to elevate the matter. I see, said Miss Marple. She picked her knitting up again. Dr. Haydock, Mr. Cross's digoxin prescription. A low dose, you said. Is digoxin, in a significantly higher quantity than prescribed, something that would produce symptoms consistent with cardiac failure? The silence this time was of a completely different character. Yes, said Dr. Haydock, it would. In a sufficient overdose, it causes precisely the kind of fatal arrhythmia that his history would make entirely plausible. He looked at her steadily. It is also colourless and nearly tasteless, particularly in tea. In tea, said Miss Marple softly. Yes, I thought it might be something of that sort. She looked out of the window at the churchyard wall, beyond which the allotments lay quiet and undisturbed in the April mist, and beyond which, in the tartan flask holder, on the potting table in the shed on plot 9, sat an empty thermos that had never been filled that morning, because Harold Cross had never had the chance. The flask, she said. When Sergeant Doyle examined the shed, was the flask examined carefully? The inside of it, I mean? I don't believe so, said Dr. Haydock. Not specifically. Then that, said Miss Marple, might be worth mentioning, before it is washed out by someone who means well. She said it with the gentle urgency of a woman who has seen evidence disappear into good intentions before, and has not forgotten the lesson. Dr. Haydock was on his feet before she had finished the sentence. He had his hat in his hand and was moving toward the door with the brisk, slightly startled energy of a man who has just remembered something important. I'll telephone Doyle directly, he said. Do give Joan my apologies, said Miss Marple. I'm afraid her shortbread will have to wait. But Doctor. Haydock was already in the hall, and Miss Marple was already returning to her knitting with the calm, unhurried air of a woman who has set something in motion and is content to let it run. The left sleeve, she noticed, had gone wrong again. She counted back 6 rows and began to unpick it, patiently, steadily, following each small stitch back to the place where the error had begun. It was, she reflected, very much the same process as everything else. Chapter 4. The Scarf by the Lich Gate. The Lich Gate at the entrance to St. Cuthbert's churchyard was one of those pleasantly ancient structures that English villages accumulate over the centuries, the way certain people accumulate useful objects, not deliberately exactly, but through a persistent inability to throw anything away that still serves a purpose. It was timber-framed, with a small pitched roof of mossy Cotswold tile, and it had stood at the junction of the church lane and the high street for long enough that the oak of its uprights had gone the colour of old pewter. A wooden bench ran along one interior side, worn smooth by 4 centuries of pallbearers, resting their burdens and mourners resting their grief, and it was here that Miss Marple paused on Wednesday morning, on the pretence of adjusting her shoe. She was not, in truth, having any difficulty with her shoe. She was looking at the ground. Just inside the Lich Gate, where the flagstone path met the gravel of the lane, there was a wooden drainage channel, a shallow, square-cut gutter designed to carry rainwater away from the church path and out beneath the gate's foundations. It was filled, as one would expect after the previous night's light rain, with a thin film of soft silted mud of the particular reddish-brown colour that the local clay produced when wet, and pressed into that mud, with the clarity of a wax seal in warm wax, were the impressions of 2 sets of footprints. One set was unremarkable. A flat-soled Wellington boot, size 9 or thereabouts, with the characteristic tread of a standard gardening boot, the sort sold in every agricultural merchant's between Oxford and Cheltenham. The prints moved through the channel from the lane side toward the churchyard, and they were evenly spaced and of consistent depth, indicating a person of average weight walking at an ordinary pace. The other set was more interesting. They were made by a leather-soled shoe, a dress shoe or something close to it, with a narrow heel and a rounded toe. They followed the same direction as the Wellington prints, but were set slightly to the right of them, as though the person had been walking beside rather than behind, or had been making a conscious effort not to step in the same places. What interested Miss Marple, however, was not their direction but their depth. The left print was considerably deeper than the right, not by a dramatic margin, not the difference one would expect from a limp or a malformation, but by the careful, consistent fraction of an inch that indicated a person carrying something of moderate weight on their left side, something carried in the left hand or over the left shoulder. She straightened up from her shoe and looked along the lane toward the allotment gate, which was visible from where she stood, a distance of perhaps 40 yards. Then she turned and looked in the opposite direction, toward the high street, where the hardware shop belonging to Mr. Neville Ashdown occupied the corner position between the post office and the greengrocer. She stood for a moment with the expression of a woman doing a very simple sum. It was at this point that she noticed the scarf. It was caught on the lower hinge of the lich gate, or rather, a single thread of it was, a fine thread of wool in a distinctive colour that Miss Marple, seeing who had been knitting for 60 years and could identify yarn by both touch and sight, with the confidence of a sommelier addressing a familiar vintage, recognised immediately as Saxon green, a heathered Saxon green to be precise, the kind produced by a specific hand-dyeing process that gave the colour a slight variation in tone across its length, so that it appeared to shift between olive and grey depending on the light. It was not a common colour. It was not a colour one found in the usual commercial ranges. She took her reading glasses from her cardigan pocket and bent close without touching. The thread was approximately 6 inches long and had been torn rather than cut. The fibres at its end were frayed in the radiating pattern of a sudden pull, rather than the clean terminus of scissors. It had been caught on the hinge, which was at a height of roughly 3 feet from the ground, and the direction of the pull, she could see from the slight bend in the remaining fibres, had been outward, toward the lane. Someone moving from the churchyard toward the lane, and in some haste. "You're admiring the gate," said a voice. She turned without hurrying. The young man standing a few feet away on the lane side had the slightly defensive expression of someone who has been watching another person do something inexplicable and has finally decided to address it. He was perhaps 30, with a good-natured, unfinished sort of face, the kind that would settle into something more decided in another decade. And he was wearing a canvas jacket over a check shirt and carrying, she noticed, a paper bag from the greengrocer. "Geoffrey Lamb," he said, apparently feeling that an introduction was appropriate. "I have plot 12, the allotments." "How do you do?" said Miss Marple warmly. "I'm staying with Joan Ashby at the rectory cottage. Jane Marple. I was admiring the gate, yes, though I confess I was also resting my feet. One does, at my age." Geoffrey Lamb had the slightly awkward gallantry of a young man who is not entirely sure how to speak to elderly women, and compensates by being very polite. "Terrible business, Mr. Cross," he said. "I was the last one to see him, you know, on Monday evening. We passed each other by the standpipe. He was locking up. I'd come to check my cloches." "Monday evening," said Miss Marple. "And what time was that, do you think?" 5:30, perhaps, 5:45. He seemed fine, normal, though he was carrying his jacket over his left arm, which was odd, because it wasn't warm, and he had that green scarf of his on, the nice wool one. He wore it every day practically, spring and autumn both. Miss Marple did not look at the thread on the hinge. She looked at Geoffrey Lamb with the mild, pleasant attention of a woman listening to a bus timetable. "A green scarf," she said. "How nice. Was it a particular shade, do you remember?" Geoffrey Lamb considered this with the faint surprise of a young man who has not previously been asked to have opinions about colour. "Greenish," he said. "Dark greenish. Sort of mossy." "How lovely," said Miss Marple. "Did he wear it loosely or knotted?" "Always knotted, the same way, just below his collar." He paused. "Why?" "No reason at all," said Miss Marple. "I'm afraid I notice scarves." "It's a great failing of mine." She smiled at him with the warm, faintly helpless smile of an elderly woman confessing to an eccentricity. "Mr. Lamb, you said you were the last to see him. Did you mention this to Sergeant Doyle?" "I called in this morning, yes. Doyle said it wasn't a criminal matter." He shifted the paper bag to his other arm. "Is it? A criminal matter?" "I really couldn't say," said Miss Marple. "I know so little about these things. I'm only an old woman with an interest in gardening and a tendency to notice scarves." She paused. "Tell me, when you passed Mr. Cross by the standpipe, was there anyone else about? On the lane or by the gate?" Geoffrey Lamb thought about this with the slightly squinting effort of a man ransacking a memory that was not organised for this kind of retrieval. "There was a car," he said slowly, "parked on the lane just past the gate. A dark green Rover, one of the older ones, the boxy sort. I don't know whose it is." He frowned. "I thought it was odd, because there's no reason to park on the lane unless you're going to the allotments or the church, and neither was open at that hour." "No," agreed Miss Marple, "neither would be." She looked thoughtfully at the high street where the corner of Mr. Ashdown's hardware shop was just visible. A dark green Rover. A man who ran a hardware shop would have access, she reflected, to any number of duplicate keys, and to any number of small, useful tools. But that was, of course, merely the idle speculation of an old woman who thought too much. "Thank you, Mr. Lamb," she said. "You've been very helpful." "I haven't said anything helpful at all," he said, with genuine puzzlement. "That," said Miss Marple gently, "is very often when one is most helpful of all." She left him standing by the Lich gate with the expression of a man who has been paid a compliment he cannot quite locate, and walked back along the lane toward the rectory cottage, her pace unhurried, her eyes on the middle distance. Behind her, on the lower hinge of the gate, the single thread of Saxon green wool stirred very slightly in the April air. She had not touched it, but she had noted the precise shade and the precise height and the precise direction of the pull, and she was already thinking about the hardware shop. Chapter 5. The ink on the ledger page. Sergeant Doyle had by Thursday morning elevated the matter. This was not entirely his own initiative. Dr. Haydock's telephone call on Tuesday afternoon regarding the flask had introduced a note of professional unease that the sergeant had found, despite his best efforts, impossible to entirely dismiss. The flask itself had been retrieved from the shed on Plot 9 and sent to the county laboratory with the careful, slightly embarrassed haste of a man correcting an oversight before anyone notices it was an oversight. The post-mortem results from Oxford were not expected until Friday at the earliest. In the meantime, Sergeant Doyle had done what English policemen of his particular type have always done when confronted with a situation that exceeds the comfortable boundaries of their experience. He had cordoned things off and waited. The allotment was closed. A length of blue and white tape had been strung between the gateposts and the adjacent fence with the slightly provisional air of a man who is not entirely certain the tape will be respected, but feels better for having put it there. A notice had been fixed to the gate. Plot 9 itself was undisturbed. Miss Marple read the notice from the lane, nodded at it with the mild approval of a woman acknowledging a sensible precaution, and walked to the High Street. The Wychwood Parish Allotment and Horticultural Society kept its administrative records in a green lever-arch file that lived. Miss Marple had learned from a careful conversation with the postmistress, on the third shelf of the bookcase in the back office of the post office and lending library, to which the committee members each had a key. The arrangement had been in place since 1947, when the society had been reconstituted after the war, and nobody had seen any reason to change it because, as the postmistress observed with the settled certainty of a woman who has held the same position for 29 years, the society's affairs were perfectly straightforward, and there was nothing in the file that could possibly be of interest to anyone who was not directly involved in the allocation of allotment plots in the parish of Little Wychwood. She had said this with the particular emphasis of a woman who had, in fact, looked in the file herself and formed her own views about what she had found there, but who considered it a matter of principle not to be the first to say so. Miss Marple, recognising the species at once, had agreed warmly that allotment records were very dull things indeed, expressed admiration for the postmistress's organisation of the lending library section, and borrowed a copy of a Josephine Tay novel she had already read twice. It was only as she was leaving, pausing at the door with the slightly distracted air of a woman remembering something, that she mentioned, quite casually, that she'd heard there had been some question about the society's accounts in the autumn. The postmistress had said nothing for the space of 4 seconds, which was, Miss Marple reflected, rather eloquent. Then she said, "There are always questions about accounts, aren't there, when they're kept by someone who isn't a qualified accountant. Not that Harold wasn't careful. He was very careful. But careful isn't always the same as correct, is it?" "No," agreed Miss Marple, "it isn't. And of course when Mr. Ashdown took over as chairman in September he did a full review, as chairmen do." Another pause, shorter this time. "He found a discrepancy in the seed fund, £43. "That is a specific sum," said Miss Marple. "Harold said it was an error in the carry-forward from the previous year, and perhaps it was." The postmistress straightened a stack of forms on her counter with unnecessary precision. "But Mr. Ashdown had the ledger photocopied before he gave it back to Harold. As chairmen do," she repeated, with the slightly clipped intonation of a woman who considers this particular chairman's behaviour not entirely within the spirit of the thing. It was this detail, the photocopied ledger, that was occupying Miss Marple's thoughts as she sat in the back room of the lending library section 40 minutes later, the green lever-arch file open on the table before her. She had the key from the committee's spare set, which the postmistress had provided with the careful, deliberate air of a woman who has decided that something ought to be looked at, and prefers not to be the one looking. The ledger was a standard cash book, ruled columns, blue ink, Harold Cross's handwriting throughout, which was small and extremely regular. the handwriting of a man trained in the pre-war clerical tradition who had never quite relinquished its disciplines. Miss Marple turned through it slowly, her reading glasses on, her expression pleasant and entirely unrevealing. She found what she was looking for on page 47. It was subtle. She would have missed it, she thought, if she had not spent 60 years reading the kind of domestic account books that village life produces in quantity, the WI Treasurer's ledgers, the Church Flower Fund records, the nursing home visitors' rota books, and if she had not developed, through that long practice, a particular sensitivity to the small physical signs of alteration. The entry for the 14th of October read, Seed Fund Disbursement, Ashdown Hardware Supplies, £43. The figures were in Harold Cross's hand, the ink was the same pale blue he used throughout. But the paper beneath those particular figures had a very slightly different texture, not different enough to be immediately obvious, but perceptible to a fingertip drawn lightly across the surface, and visible under the right angle of light as a faint compressed smoothness, as though the original surface had been disturbed and resettled. Someone had used an ink eradicator, a careful, thorough job, but not quite thorough enough, because below the entry, in the margin, in an ink considerably blacker and more permanent than the pale blue of the main ledger, there was a small notation, a date, the 22nd of September, and two initials, N.A. India ink, the permanent kind, used by draftsmen and architects and, Miss Marple thought of the hardware shop on the corner of the high street, by people who handled technical documents and knew better than to use anything that could be washed out. Harold Cross had made a notation in India ink because he had known, or suspected, that someone might alter the entry around it. A small act of professional caution from a man trained to be careful with documents. And someone had altered the entry, had removed whatever the original disbursement figure was, and replaced it with a sum that corresponded to a purchase from Ashdown Hardware Supplies, thereby both explaining the £43 and implicating the very man who had raised the alarm about the discrepancy, or exonerating him depending on which version of the ledger you were shown. Miss Marple sat for a moment with her hands folded on the table looking at the entry. N.A. Neville Ashdown, the chairman who had performed a full review, the chairman who had had the ledger photocopied, the man who ran the hardware shop who drove, she thought of Geoffrey Lamb's observation, a dark green Rover who had access to duplicate keys, who had raised the matter of the £43 publicly, who had thereby established himself as the man pursuing accountability rather than the man evading it. And Harold Cross, who had been 22 years a careful treasurer, who had planted his shallots in straight lines and drunk his tea at 11 o'clock and watered his parsley on Tuesdays, had known something, had marked something, had, she suspected, been in the process of bringing it to light. Salt had perhaps told someone he intended to. She closed the file with the quiet, unhurried care of a woman who has found what she came for and sees no need to advertise the fact. The Josephine Tay novel was in her bag. The key was on the table. She left both the room and the building in the same pleasant, slightly vague manner in which she had entered it, the manner of a woman who has been browsing books and found nothing in particular of interest. Outside on the high street, the sign above the hardware shop swung very slightly in the April wind. Ashdown and Sons, established in 1931. Miss Marple looked at it for a moment, then looked away. She had, she thought, enough now to begin to see the shape of it, not the whole, not yet. There were still the questions of method and of opportunity, and of what exactly had been in Harold Cross's flask, before it had so carefully not been filled on Tuesday morning. But the shape was there, and shapes, in Miss Marple's experience, did not generally improve the more you looked at them. Chapter 6. A Jar of Damson Jam. There are certain domestic rituals in English village life that function less as acts of hospitality, and more as a finely calibrated social instrument. And the delivery of a jar of homemade preserve is perhaps the most versatile of these. It can express congratulation, condolence, apology, and surveillance with equal facility, requiring only that the recipient be sufficiently absorbed in the gesture to overlook the motivation behind it. Miss Marple had been deploying this particular instrument since approximately 1923, and she deployed it now with the practiced ease of a woman who has never once been suspected of deploying it at all. The jar in question belonged to Joan, who kept a well-stocked larder and who was accustomed to her aunt borrowing provisions for purposes that were never entirely explained and always, eventually, justified. It was damson jam, a very good one, deep and slightly tart, the damsons having come from the old tree at the bottom of the rectory garden, and Joan having added rather more sugar than the recipe strictly demanded, which produced a set that was firm without being rigid, and a colour that was frankly magnificent. Miss Marple wrapped it in a square of brown paper and walked, at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, to the house of Mr. Neville Ashdown. The Ashdown residence was a detached Victorian villa at the quieter end of Millbrook Lane, the sort of house that announces its owner's modest prosperity through a combination of well-pointed brickwork, a brass door knocker in the shape of a fox's head, and a front garden maintained to a standard that falls just short of ostentation. There were rose bushes, not yet in bloom, pruned to a height that suggested either considerable knowledge or a very reliable gardening manual. There was a gravel path, freshly raked. There was a boot scraper beside the front step that actually had mud on it, which meant it was used, which meant someone in the household came and went through the garden rather than exclusively through the front door. Miss Marple noted all of this in the time it took her to walk from the gate to the door. She knocked. The woman who answered was not, Miss Marple judged, Mrs. Ashdown, or rather she was not the kind of woman one instinctively thought of as a wife in this particular kind of house. She was perhaps 40, with the composed, slightly watchful expression of a person who answers other people's doors professionally, and has long since stopped being curious about who is on the other side of them. A daily help, or something more permanent. She wore a cotton housecoat over a dark skirt and held a duster in her left hand with the unconscious authority of a woman who considers it her natural implement. "Good morning," said Miss Marple. "I wonder if Mr. Ashdown is at home. I'm staying with Joan Ashby at the rectory cottage. Jane Marple. I've brought a small thing, just a gesture of... Well, it seems such a difficult time for the allotment community, and I understand Mr. Ashdown is the chairman, and one does feel one ought to acknowledge." She allowed this sentence to dissolve gently into the air in the manner of a woman whose thoughts are rather too numerous to be contained by any single grammatical structure. The daily help, for so she appeared to be, regarded her for a moment with the expression of a person performing a rapid and largely unconscious social calculation. Then she said, "Mr. Ashdown is in the garden. I'll tell him you're here." She was shown into a sitting room that told her a considerable amount about its owner in a very short time. It was tidy in the way that rooms are tidy when tidiness is a matter of discipline rather than inclination. Everything in its proper place, nothing left casually, no books open on the arm of a chair or letters half read on the side table. The mantelpiece held a clock. 2 candlesticks of identical height, and a photograph of a man and woman on what appeared to be a walking holiday, the man being recognisably a younger and slightly less settled version of the face she was about to meet. The bookshelves contained a complete set of Wisden's Cricketer's Almanac, a row of Reader's Digest condensed volumes, and, she noted this with the quiet attention it deserved, a manual on contract law, and beside it, a narrower volume with a pale green spine, Pharmaceutical Compounds and Their Domestic Applications. 3rd edition. It had been taken out recently. The spine showed the slight angle of a book that has been replaced in a hurry, its edge not quite flush with its neighbours. Miss Marple was examining the photograph on the mantelpiece with the innocent appreciation of a woman admiring a pleasant view when Neville Ashdown came in from the garden. He was a tall man, perhaps 60, with the physical confidence of someone accustomed to occupying space without apology. His face was broad and well-maintained, his manner that of a man who expects to be found reasonable, and is slightly surprised on the occasions when he is not. He wore a green waxed jacket over a shirt and tie, the tie being, she noticed, a very particular shade of dark green. Not Saxon green, bottle green, but green nonetheless. He carried his jacket over his left arm, which briefly recalled what Geoffrey Lamb had said about Harold Cross on Monday evening. She set this aside for the moment. "Miss Marple?" He shook her hand with the careful warmth of a man conducting a social obligation. "Iris said you'd called. Very kind of you to come." He glanced at the jar she'd set on the side table. "That's most thoughtful." "It seemed the least one could do," said Miss Marple. "Such a shock about Mr. Cross. I understand you worked together closely on the committee." "For just over a year, yes." He sat down and gestured for her to take the chair opposite with the ease of a man on his own territory. Harold was a thorough treasurer, very dedicated. He said this in the tone of a man completing a required sentence rather than volunteering an opinion. "I imagine the accounts will need to be handed on to someone," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Such a responsibility, a treasurer's records. All that history in one place." Something moved behind Neville Ashdown's eyes, something quick and small, like a fish turning in shallow water, gone before it could properly be seen. "We'll manage," he said. "The records are straightforward enough." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "I suppose a man like Mr. Cross, so precise, so methodical, would have kept everything in excellent order. Ledgers, receipts, correspondence, all the supporting documents one would expect." She smiled with the gentle vagueness of a woman making the most innocuous possible conversation. "I do so admire people who keep proper records. In my experience, it's the only real protection one has, isn't it? If there's ever any question, any confusion about dates or figures, it's all there, quite clear, for anyone to see." The silence that followed lasted no more than 2 seconds, but it was a different sort of silence to the ones that had preceded it in this room. It had a texture to it. "Quite," said Neville Ashdown. "Of course," Miss Marple continued, setting her bag on her lap with the comfortable movements of a woman settling in for a pleasant chat. "Sometimes records require a little interpretation, don't you find? Particularly when figures have been adjusted for clarity." She looked up at him with the clear, mild eyes of a woman who has said something entirely innocent and has no idea it could be taken any other way. "I find old ledgers rather fascinating myself. The way they tell the story of a community page by page, every transaction, every disbursement, even the ones that have been corrected." Neville Ashdown was very still. He was a man who had spent his professional life reading the intentions of customers and suppliers and planning authorities, and he was not, by temperament or training, a man who was easily wrong-footed. But he was also a man who had done something that he had believed to be invisible, and he was now sitting across from a small elderly woman who was smiling at him with the particular smile of someone who can see the bottom of a pool he had thought entirely opaque. "Miss Marple," he said, and his voice had changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone but a careful listener to detect, but the warmth had been redistributed, spread thinner, and what remained was something cooler and more careful underneath. "I'm not sure I entirely follow you." "No," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "I don't suppose you do." She rose from her chair with the slight effortfulness of a woman of her age, picked up her bag and looked at him with an expression that was kind and clear and entirely without mercy. "Do enjoy the jam. Damson keeps very well, and I find the flavour rather deepens the longer one leaves it to settle." She paused at the door. "I believe Sergeant Doyle expects the post-mortem results tomorrow. I do hope the day passes quietly for you." She left him sitting in his tidy room, beneath his ordered bookshelves, beside the pharmaceutical manual that had been replaced in a hurry. On the mantelpiece the clock ticked with the patient, even rhythm of something that cannot be stopped. Chapter 7. The Duplicate Key. Friday arrived in Little Wychwood with the particular quality of English April mornings that cannot quite decide what they intend. The sky a pale, unresolved grey, the air neither warm nor cold but occupying some provisional middle ground, as though the day itself were withholding judgment until it had seen how things developed. It was, Miss Marple thought, looking out of Joan's parlour window at 7:30, with her first cup of tea, rather appropriate weather for a day on which several things were likely to be decided. Dr. Haydock had telephoned at 7 o'clock. The post-mortem results had come through from Oxford during the night. He had spoken to Sergeant Doyle at 6:30. He said very little beyond this, in the careful, considered way of a man who is aware that telephone conversations are not, in villages of this size, entirely private. But what he said was enough. Miss Marple finished her tea, put on her grey cardigan, and went to find her gardening gloves. She had been thinking about the key since Wednesday. The allotment gate, she had examined it briefly on Tuesday morning before the police tape had been strung across it, was secured by a standard 5-lever mortise lock of the type manufactured in large quantities since the 1930s, and sold, she was quite certain, at any number of ironmongery establishments throughout Oxfordshire. It was the kind of lock that any competent locksmith could open with a suitable blank in under 10 minutes, and that any ironmonger with a key-cutting machine could duplicate from an original in considerably less. Farm Ashdown Hardware Supplies had a key-cutting machine. She had seen it herself through the shop window on Thursday morning as she had walked back from Millbrook Lane, a small electric grinder bolted to the counter, the wire rack of blanks beside it arranged with the neat precision of a man who liked his stock in order. The question that had been occupying her was not whether Neville Ashdown had made a duplicate key to the allotment gate. She was tolerably certain he had, or that he had access to one, but when. And specifically whether the key had been made before or after Harold Cross had approached him, sometime in late September or early October, about the discrepancy in the seed fund accounts. Because there were two possible constructions of what had happened, and while they arrived at the same destination they were, key in terms of character and premeditation, very different journeys. In the first construction, Neville Ashdown had been diverting small sums from the allotment committee's seed fund for some months, routing payments through his own hardware shop, marking them in the ledger as legitimate disbursements, and relying on the combination of his authority as chairman and Harold Cross's thoroughness as treasurer to provide the appearance of proper accounting. When Harold had discovered the alteration, or had begun to suspect it, Ashdown had acted, quickly and with the kind of precise, unhurried execution that suggested not passion but calculation. In the second construction, the seed fund irregularity was considerably larger and older than £43, and Harold Cross had been covering it, willingly or otherwise, for reasons that the ledger even now had not fully revealed. Miss Marple did not, on the whole, favour the second construction. Harold Cross's India ink notation, the date, and the initials pressed permanently into the margin of the ledger page, was not the act of a man protecting a secret. It was the act of a man building a case. He had marked the page because he had known the entry would be altered, which meant he had confronted Ashdown, or signalled his intention to do so, and had been precise enough about the likely response to take precautions before it came. That was the behaviour, she thought, not of a guilty man, but of a frightened one. A careful, conscientious, fundamentally honest man who had discovered something he should not have discovered, and who had known, with the instinct of someone who has spent 22 years managing other people's money, exactly how dangerous that discovery was. She was making her way down the lane toward the allotment gate as she thought this through, her pace unhurried, her eyes on the ground ahead of her with the mild, slightly preoccupied air of a woman, watching her footing on uneven ground. She was not watching her footing on uneven ground. She was watching the gate. Sergeant Doyle was already there. He was a larger man than she had expected, tall, broad-shouldered, with the weathered face of someone who has spent a great deal of time outdoors and a somewhat smaller amount of time indoors thinking, and who is not entirely at peace with the recent reversal of this ratio. He was standing beside the gate with a young constable whose name she did not know, and they were both looking at something on the ground just inside the gate, with the cautious attention of men who've been told to look carefully and are doing their conscientious best. "Miss Marple," said Doyle, and there was in his tone the complex, not entirely comfortable mixture of respect and wariness that she had encountered before in policemen of his generation, men who had been wrong-footed by elderly ladies in the past and were not anxious to repeat the experience. "Dr. Haydock said you might come by. I hope I'm not in the way," said Miss Marple. "No," said Doyle, in a tone that indicated he had considered saying yes and thought better of it. The Oxford results confirmed de Goxin toxicity, significant overdose. The flask had residue, diluted but identifiable. "In the flask itself," said Miss Marple, "not in a cup." "In the flask, yes," he paused, "which means it was added before Mr. Cross arrived at the allotment on Tuesday morning. Possibly the previous evening." "Monday evening," said Miss Marple, "when Geoffrey Lamb saw Mr. Cross by the standpipe at 5:30 locking up, and when a dark green Rover was parked on the lane without obvious reason." She paused. "Have you had occasion to look at Mr. Ashdown's vehicle, Sergeant?" Doyle looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man revising an estimate. "We have," he said. "This morning. There is a scratch on the near side door, recent by the look of it, consistent with a narrow metal edge, the kind a gate hinge might produce." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the shed. Forced at some point. Impossible to say when, the mechanism was old, but there are fresh scratches on the lock plate consistent with a key that did not quite fit. A duplicate, perhaps, cut from a blank rather than an original, with the very slight imprecision that produces. He would have had access to the original at some point," said Miss Marple. "Committee business, perhaps. Keys are left on tables during meetings. It takes very little time." She looked at the gate, then at the shed beyond it. "He came on Monday evening, after Mr. Cross had gone. He had the duplicate key. He let himself in through the gate, catching his jacket or his scarf on the hinge as he went to the shed and put something in the flask." She said this with the quiet, factual tone of a woman describing something she's watched happen, though she'd watched none of it. "He replaced the flask in its holder on the potting table, locked the shed with his duplicate key and left. He knew Mr. Cross would fill the flask in the morning, as he always did, without fail. Habit, she added, almost to herself, is the great vulnerability. It is the one thing a killer can always rely on. Doyle was writing in his notebook with the slightly stunned application of a man taking down dictation he is not expected to be taking. The young constable had stopped pretending to look at the ground and was watching Miss Marple with unguarded interest. "There is one further thing," said Miss Marple, "the scarf." She described the thread on the Lich gate hinge, its colour, its height, the direction of the pull. She described Geoffrey Lamb's account of Harold Cross's green scarf, knotted below the collar. She described the pharmaceutical manual on the third shelf of Neville Ashdown's sitting-room bookcase, replaced at a slight angle in the hurry of a man who had recently had cause to consult it. When she'd finished, Doyle looked at his notebook for a moment, then looked at her. "The thread is still on the hinge," she said gently. "I thought it best not to touch it." Doyle nodded once, slowly. Then he said, in the tone of a man who is asking a genuine question rather than a rhetorical one, "How did you know to look at the parsley first?" Miss Marple considered this. "Because a man of Mr. Cross's habits," she said, "would never have left his parsley bed uncovered after rain. He knew the overnight forecast. He would have replaced the glass frame on Monday evening before he left." She paused. "He did not replace it, which meant he did not have the opportunity, which meant that between the time he locked his shed at 5:30 and the time he left the allotment, something, or someone, prevented him from attending to it." She looked at the shed with its old lock and its fresh scratches. "He saw something, Sergeant. Or he saw someone. He went to the gate, perhaps to speak to them, and he was detained long enough to be given something, in his flask or in some other way, that he could not have known was there." She paused again. "And then he went home, and he made his evening tea, and he put his flask out ready for the morning, as he always did, and he did not know that it was already too late." The lane was quiet. Somewhere in the churchyard beyond the wall, a wood pigeon was making its low, persistent sound. The same phrase endlessly repeated, patient and unreasoning, as though meaning might eventually emerge from repetition alone. Doyle closed his notebook. "I'll need to speak to Mr. Ashdown this morning." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think you will." She left him there with his constable and his notebook and his scratched lock plate and his thread of Saxon green wool caught on a gate hinge in the April light, and walked back along the lane toward the rectory cottage and Joan and the second cup of tea she had been promising herself since 7:30. She was almost at the gate when she stopped and turned as though she had forgotten something. "Sergeant Doyle," she called back. He looked up. "The ledger," she said. "Page 47. The India ink notation in the margin. Do have it examined before Mr. Ashdown has any opportunity to visit the post office." She paused. "He has a key to that room as well, I believe." Doyle was already moving toward his car. Miss Marple watched him go, then turned back toward the cottage, where Joan's kitchen window was lit yellow against the grey morning, and where the smell of toast, warm, ordinary, entirely reliable, was making its way out through the garden with the quiet persistence of something that intends to be found. Chapter 8. What the Soil Remembered. Neville Ashdown was taken in for questioning at 11 o'clock on Friday morning. Miss Marple knew this not because Sergeant Doyle had informed her. He had not, which she thought entirely correct of him, but because Mrs. Prentice had telephoned Joan's cottage at 11:20 with the news, delivered in the careful, slightly breathless tone of a woman who considers herself a responsible conduit of important information, and is at some pains to distinguish this from gossip. The distinction, Miss Marple had long observed, was one that people in villages drew with great conviction and very little accuracy, but she found it no less endearing for that. She thanked Joan, who had taken the call and went to put on her coat. She was not going to the police station. She was going to the allotment. The blue and white tape had been removed from the gate, either because Sergeant Doyle had what he needed from the site or because, in the focused haste of the morning's developments, nobody had thought to keep it in place. Miss Marple found the gate unlocked, which suggested the former. She pushed it open with the careful, deliberate pressure of a woman who is aware she is entering a place she has not been invited to enter, and has decided that this is a distinction she can, on balance, live with. Plot 9 lay exactly as it had on Tuesday morning. The leeks in their straight rows, the shallots in their raised beds, the shed door closed and its padlock hanging open, where Doyle's men had been through it. The daffodils stood in their 3 rows along the western edge, upright and undisturbed, their yellow quite brilliant against the grey of the morning sky, with the cheerful and faintly indecent vitality that flowers display in the immediate neighbourhood of death and seem to intend no offence by. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the plot for a moment and looked at the ground. This was the thing she had come to do, and she did it with the unhurried attention of a woman who knows that soil, properly read, is as precise a record of events as any ledger page. She had been a gardener all her adult life, and she had learned, through the accumulated evidence of 60 years of planting, digging, weeding and watching, that disturbed earth tells the truth even when the people who disturbed it have taken considerable trouble to prevent it from doing so. The area around the daffodil rows had dried somewhat since Tuesday. 2 days of April air and intermittent thin sunlight had taken the surface moisture from it, but it had not dried uniformly. Soil that has been walked upon compresses differently to soil that has merely been rained on, and the compression persists through the drying process in a way that a careful observer can still read. Miss Marple moved along the edge of the daffodil beds with the slow, methodical patience of a woman who's in no hurry and has nowhere else to be. She found 3 things. The first was a compression pattern in the soil between the 2nd and 3rd daffodil rows, roughly oval, approximately the width of a man's shoulders, at the far western end of the bed. It was the kind of impression left not by a fall, which produces a different and less even distribution of weight, but by something placed deliberately. Something of a man's approximate weight and dimensions, set down with enough care that the flowers on either side had been parted rather than crushed. Placed, not fallen, which she had suspected since Tuesday morning, but which the soil now confirmed with the quiet, impersonal authority of physical evidence. The second was a series of 4 depressions in the soft earth of the path that ran along the western boundary of Plot 9, between the daffodil beds and the compost heap. They were deeper at the toe than at the heel, and they were spaced at intervals of approximately 30 inches. The stride pattern of a person moving with effort, carrying a significant weight forward, leaning into the load. The depressions were partially dried over but still clearly defined at their centres. They pointed toward the western end of the bed, where the compression pattern was, and they came from the direction of the gate. Someone had carried Harold Cross across his own allotment and laid him among his daffodils. The third thing was smaller and might easily have been missed. At the edge of the compost heap, half buried in a scatter of last autumn's dead leaves that had blown against the wooden boards, was a small glass bottle, the size of a chemist's dispensing bottle, perhaps 2 inches tall, with a rubber-stopped neck and no label. It was empty. The rubber stopper had been replaced but not quite fully seated, so that a faint discoloration was visible on the rim of the neck, the kind left by a liquid of slight viscosity. Colourless, or nearly so. Miss Marple did not touch the bottle. She stood and looked at it for a long moment, then straightened up and looked at the shed, and then at the gate, and then back at the compression pattern in the earth among the daffodils, assembling the sequence of events in the order they had most probably occurred. Harold Cross had come to his allotment at some point on Monday evening, after Geoffrey Lamb had seen him at 5:30 but before dark. Neville Ashdown had been there, or had arrived shortly after, in his dark green Rover parked on the lane. There had been a conversation, perhaps at the gate, perhaps inside the plot. At some point during this conversation, or as a consequence of it, Crossy had been given the contents of the small glass bottle. Not in his flask. The flask was the secondary vehicle. The insurance, the method that would be found and identified if the primary method proved insufficient, or if Cross had not used the flask as expected. She thought about this for a moment. A man who had just had a troubling conversation with his committee chairman might not, on returning home, feel particularly inclined to make his usual evening tea. The flask was a contingency. If Cross had decided to drink his flask at some point during Tuesday, the diluted digoxin would have completed what had been begun. But Ashdown had needed something more reliable, something immediate, whose effects would manifest that evening after Cross had left the allotment, and whose cause would be entirely consistent with his documented medical history. The bottle, then, had been administered directly, in something Cross had consumed at the allotment, or by some other means, a hip flask perhaps, the offer of a drink between 2 men conducting difficult business, the kind of gesture that disarms precisely because it seems collegial. Miss Marple thought of Neville Ashdown's sitting room, its enforced tidiness, its ordered bookshelves, the pharmaceutical manual replaced at a slight angle. She thought of a man who had spent 40 years running a hardware business and who understood, with the practical intelligence of such men, the mechanics of things, how locks worked, how keys were cut, how substances might be obtained and measured and delivered in quantities that would be effective, but not so grossly excessive as to be immediately suspicious to a doctor who expected to find cardiac failure. He had been thorough. He had been careful. He had arranged the body with the attention to detail of a man who understood that untidiness attracts scrutiny, and that a scene which conformed to natural expectations would receive natural explanations. He had known about the digoxin prescription. Committee chairmen and solicitors' clerks move in the same small professional circles in a village of this size, and medical histories are rather less private in such communities than their subjects generally suppose. He had thought of most things. He had not thought of India ink. He had not thought of a thread of Saxon green wool on a gate hinge. He had not thought of a woman in a grey cardigan who was staying at the rectory cottage, and had nothing to do but look at things with the unhurried attention of a person who has learned that the truth, in any environment, leaves physical evidence of its passage, in ledgers and in soil, in the depth of footprints and the cover of a parsley bed, in the angle of a replaced book, and the slight, persistent dryness of earth that should have been wet. Miss Marple looked at the small glass bottle for the last time. Then she walked to the gate, found a young constable she had not previously seen standing at the lane end, and said, in the pleasant, slightly apologetic tone of a woman who hopes she's not causing inconvenience, "There is something in the compost heap on plot 9 that I think Sergeant Doyle will want to see. A small glass bottle at the western edge, under the dead leaves. I haven't touched it." The constable stared at her. "I came in through the gate," she added helpfully. "It was unlocked." "I am sorry about that. I don't think I ought to have done." She said this with the mild, genuine contrition of a woman who has transgressed a minor rule, and the serene composure of one who would do so again without a moment's hesitation. The constable, after a pause of some duration, went to telephone his sergeant. Miss Marple adjusted her gardening gloves. She had not, in the end, needed them, and walked back along the lane toward the rectory cottage, where Joan was making soup for luncheon, and had no idea that her aunt had just concluded the better part of a murder investigation in a disused allotment on a grey Friday morning in April, armed with nothing more than 60 years of gardening, a working knowledge of human nature, and the particular quality of attention that most people mistake entirely to the killer's cost. For a harmless old lady's idle curiosity, Chapter 9, Miss Marple Speaks Plainly. Sergeant Doyle came to the rectory cottage at 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. He came alone, which Miss Marple thought indicated something. A man who brings a constable to a conversation is conducting an interview. A man who comes alone is conducting something rather more personal and considerably more honest. He wore his coat rather than his uniform jacket, and he had taken his hat off before Joan had finished opening the door, which she found charming and Miss Marple found informative. He was not here in an official capacity precisely. He was here because he had questions that official channels had not answered, and because there was only one person in Little Wychwood who was likely to answer them. Joan, who had a sound instinct for these things, made tea and then found pressing reasons to be elsewhere in the house. They sat on either side of the parlour fireplace. Joan had lit it at lunchtime against the grey persistence of the afternoon, and Doyle put his notebook on the table beside him with the air of a man who has brought it out of habit and suspects he will not need it. "Ashdown is still at the station," he said. "He has a solicitor. He is saying very little." "He would," said Miss Marple. "He is an intelligent man. Intelligent men who have done something of this nature generally say very little in the early stages, because they understand that the case against them is, at this point, largely circumstantial, and that circumstantial evidence, however compelling, requires time to be made definitive." She paused. "The bottle from the compost heap will help. If the laboratory can identify digoxin residue, and if the stopper carries any useful impression — fingers leave oils on rubber, I believe, that are more persistent than on smooth surfaces — then his position becomes considerably more difficult." Doyle looked at her for a moment. "The laboratory says the bottle contained a solution consistent with concentrated digoxin," he said. "They're working on the stopper now." "Good," said Miss Marple. "The ledger has been examined by a document specialist in Oxford. The erasure on page 47 is confirmed. The original entry, what remains of it beneath the eradication, appears to show a sum considerably larger than £43. They're still working on recovering the full figure." He paused. The India ink notation is confirmed as genuine, share and prior in date to the alteration. Harold Cross was a careful man, said Miss Marple quietly. He knew what he'd found, and he knew that it would be his word against the word of a chairman with rather more standing in the community. So he protected himself in the only way available to a person without power in such a situation. He made a permanent record. She looked at the fire. It did not protect him in the end, but it did ensure that the truth survived him, which is, perhaps, what he most wanted. Doyle was quiet for a moment. How long do you think it had been going on? The diversion of funds? I would guess 2 years, possibly 3. Small sums. Small enough not to attract immediate attention, but cumulative. The hardware shop has been under some financial pressure, I believe. She said this without particular emphasis, in the tone of a woman relaying a fact she has gathered from the ordinary drift of village conversation. Iris, the woman who answered the door at Millbrook Lane, has been there only 8 months. Before her there was no daily help at all, for a period of approximately 18 months, which in a household of that size and standard of maintenance suggests a contraction of income that was not immediately apparent from outside. She paused. One notices these things. Do you? Said Doyle, in the tone of a man who is no longer surprised but has not yet reached the point of being entirely comfortable with the alternative. I'm afraid so, said Miss Marple with genuine apology. It's a great failing. But domestic economies in a village are rather visible if one looks. People stop sending things to the laundry and do them at home. They change their butcher. They stop replacing small things, curtain linings, boot scrapers, that sort of thing, that they would previously have replaced without thinking. She looked at the fire. Neville Ashdown had been managing a quiet financial difficulty for some time. The allotment seed fund was a small pool of money under his effective control, without sufficient independent oversight, because Harold Cross trusted in the chairman's probity, and the chairman relied on that trust. She folded her hands in her lap. It is always trust that makes these things possible, and it is always trust that makes the discovery of them feel like such a personal betrayal. Doyle picked up his notebook, then set it down again. Can I ask you something? Of course. When did you know that it wasn't natural causes? Miss Marple considered this with the genuine care of a woman who does not like to be imprecise. I suspected, on Tuesday morning, when I saw the Parsley bed. I was more or less certain by Tuesday evening, when I had spoken to Mrs. Prentice and learned about the accounts difficulty, and by Wednesday morning, the footprints in the Lich Gate drainage channel and the thread on the hinge. I had what I think of as a working picture. Not proof, never proof at that stage, but a picture clear enough to work from. She paused. The ledger confirmed the motive. The bottle confirmed the method. The footprint pattern in the soil on plot 9 confirmed the mechanics, that he was placed, not fallen. She looked up. Though I imagine a court will require rather more than an old woman's reading of a garden. A court will have the laboratory results, the document examination, the witness statements, and the physical evidence, said Doyle. Your reading of the garden is... He stopped and began again. It pointed us to everything else. Without it, we would have closed the file on Monday. You would have reopened it, said Miss Marple firmly. Dr. Haydock had reservations. He would have pressed the matter. Perhaps, said Doyle, with the honesty of a man who is not entirely certain this is true. There was a comfortable silence. The fire shifted, settling into itself with a small sound of compression and release. Ashdown, said Doyle presently. He seemed, when we brought him in, he seemed almost relieved. In a strange way, he frowned at the fireplace. I've seen that before, occasionally, and I've never quite understood it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The effort of maintaining a false position is rather exhausting, she said. Particularly for a methodical man, a man who values order and precision, as Ashdown clearly does. He had been holding a great many things in the correct arrangement for a considerable time. The accounts, the ledger, the timing of Monday evening, the arrangement of Harold in the garden. She paused. There is a particular kind of relief in being found out. Not a pleasant relief, nothing so simple as that. But the relief of no longer having to hold everything in place by sheer force of will. She looked at the fire. He would have found it more tiring than anyone looking at him from the outside could possibly have imagined. Does that, Doyle chose his words with visible care, does that make you feel differently about it? About him? Miss Marple looked at him for a moment with the clear, steady gaze of a woman who has thought about this question, in various forms for the better part of 80 years. No, she said, not differently about what he did. Harold Cross was a thoroughly decent man who had spent 22 years looking after other people's money with complete integrity, and who was killed because he could not bring himself to look away from an injustice, and because Neville Ashdown could not bring himself to face the consequences of being found out. She said this without anger, in the level, factual tone of a woman making a plain statement about human nature. The relief he feels is his own affair. The fact of what he did to Harold Cross is something quite separate, and no amount of exhaustion or remorse alters it. She paused. That is not hardness. I want to be clear about that. I feel a great deal of compassion for the circumstances that lead people to these positions, but compassion and accountability are not in opposition. In fact, I think true compassion requires that we hold people accountable, because the alternative, the quiet agreement, the convenient verdict, the closed file, is not kindness to anyone, least of all to the person who was killed. Doyle looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his tea, which had gone cold without either of them noticing, and drank it anyway. "I'll need a formal statement," he said. "Everything you observed, in order, from Tuesday morning. I'll send Constable Havers tomorrow, if that's convenient." "Quite convenient," said Miss Marple. "I shall make sure Joan provides biscuits. Constable Havers strikes me as a young man who benefits from biscuits." Doyle stood, put on his coat, picked up his hat. At the door he turned, with the expression of a man who has one more thing to say, and is not entirely sure how to say it. "Miss Marple," he said, "in future, if you're in the area and if you happen to notice anything—" "I always happen to notice things, Sergeant," said Miss Marple gently. "I'm afraid it's quite involuntary." He nodded once, put his hat on, and went out into the grey April afternoon. Miss Marple sat for a moment in the quiet of the parlour, listening to the fire and to Joan moving in the kitchen above, and to the distant, persistent sound of the wood pigeon in the churchyard, still repeating its 4 notes into the cooling air. Then she picked up her knitting. The left sleeve of the pale blue bed jacket she found had finally come right. She counted the rows twice to be certain, then continued, her needles moving with the even, unhurried rhythm of a woman who has finished one thing and is content for the moment simply to proceed. Chapter 10. The Moral of the Garden. The last frost of the season came on Saturday night. Miss Marple knew it was coming because the sky at dusk had cleared to that particular depthless blue that only appears in April when the temperature intends to drop sharply before morning, and because the wood pigeon in the churchyard had gone quiet an hour earlier than usual, which was, in her experience, a more reliable indicator than any barometer Joan kept in the hallway. She had mentioned this to Joan over supper, and Joan had said, in the fond, slightly distracted way of a niece, who has long since accepted that her aunt notices things that other people do not, and has learned to treat this as a background condition of life rather than something requiring active engagement. Miss Marple had gone to bed at 10 o'clock and slept well, as she generally did after matters had been properly resolved, with the deep, untroubled sleep of a woman whose conscience is clear and whose mind has been given the satisfaction of having worked a thing through to its proper conclusion. She was up at 6 and in the garden by past, with her cardigan and her gardening gloves and the particular quality of attention she reserved for mornings after frost, moving slowly along Joan's flower beds, assessing what the cold had taken and what it had spared, lifting the occasional leaf with one gentle finger to see what lay beneath. The frost had been light. The hardy things, the wallflowers, the forget-me-nots, the early alliums pushing their grey-green spears through the soil with the patient determination of things that have survived worse, were quite unharmed. The tender things that ought not to have been planted out yet had suffered, but not beyond recovery. The roses still in bud had taken the cold without complaint. She stood for a moment in the centre of the garden, her gloves on, her breath just visible in the pale early air, and looked at the churchyard wall. Beyond it the allotment gate was closed and latched. Plot 9 was silent. The daffodils were still there. She could see their yellow heads above the wall, unmoved by the frost as daffodils always are, their constitutions being better suited to cold than to warmth, which is perhaps why they bloom in April rather than July. Harold Cross had planted them, she thought, in the autumn, knelt on that same earth, pressed each bulb into the ground at precisely the right depth and the right interval, as he did everything, or see, with the patient, unshowy care of a man who did not need to be watched in order to do things properly. He had not lived to see them, but they were there, 18 inches apart in 3 straight rows just as he had put them. She thought this was not nothing. Neville Ashdown was charged on Saturday afternoon. Mrs. Prentice telephoned Jones Cottage at 5:30 with this information, and this time Miss Marple was in the parlour and took the call herself. She thanked Mrs. Prentice, expressed the hope that the allotment community would find its way through the difficulty, and rang off before Mrs. Prentice could invite further conversation, which she had learned, over the past week, was a thing that required deliberate management. She sat for a moment with the telephone receiver replaced and her hand still on it, looking at the wall. She was not particularly thinking about Neville Ashdown. She was thinking about the nature of small communities, about the particular kind of wickedness that grows not in dramatic isolation, but in the ordinary texture of village life, in committee meetings and account books, in the small daily transactions of trust and familiarity, in the accumulated assumptions that people make about one another when they have lived side by side for long enough to have stopped really looking. She had seen it before, more times than she would have wished, not in extraordinary people, not in the kind of individual who seems dangerous from the outside, but in ordinary ones, respectable ones, people with brass door-knockers and well-pruned rose bushes and a reputation carefully maintained for being the sort of person who could be relied upon. The reliance was the thing. It was always the thing. People who were trusted did not have to be particularly clever to exploit that trust, because the trust itself was a kind of blindness, a voluntary, well-intentioned refusal to look too closely at someone who had always appeared to deserve the benefit of the doubt. Neville Ashdown had understood this. He had cultivated it over years as deliberately as any gardener cultivates a particular soil, and he had used it in the end to do something entirely unforgivable to a man who had trusted him. And Harold Cross, who had been careful and honest and thorough, and rather lonely, had looked too closely, had seen what was there, had written it down in permanent ink on a ledger page that could not be erased, and had paid for that attention with his life among his own daffodils, and on a Tuesday morning in April. Miss Marple looked at the wall for a long time. Then she thought of something else entirely, of Mrs. Badger in St. Mary Mead, who had run the post office accounts for the Church Restoration Fund for 11 years with complete probity, never once taking a penny, though the oversight was negligible, and the temptation, given her circumstances, must have been considerable. And of Mr. Hartley, who had been treasurer of the St. Mary Mead Horticultural Society for 15 years and had kept every receipt in a proper folder, cross-referenced in case anyone should ever wish to check. And of any number of other quiet, careful, honest people who did their work without recognition and without drama, and whose goodness was invisible precisely because it did not call attention to itself. For every Neville Ashdown, hussy she thought, there were a dozen Harold Crosses, people who did the right thing not because they were watching, not because there was a ledger to balance before an audience, but because they were constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise, because integrity in such people was not a performance but a habit, as deep and as unconsidered as the habit of breathing. This was the thing that Miss Marple had always believed, and that 50 years of observing human nature had consistently confirmed, that wickedness was not the norm. It was striking, and therefore memorable, and therefore seemed more prevalent than it was. But the ordinary run of human beings, the Mrs. Badgers and the Mr. Hartleys and the Harold Crosses, were decent. Quietly, persistently, unspectacularly decent. It was simply that decency, being unremarkable. Joe was not a thing that anyone was inclined to look for, whereas the crack in the surface, the parsley bed left uncovered, the footprint deeper on one side than the other, the book replaced at an angle on the shelf, that, if you knew how to look, was always there to be found. She was in the garden again on Sunday morning, earlier than the day before, when Geoffrey Lamb appeared at the gate of the allotments across the way. He had a trowel in his hand and the slightly self-conscious expression of a young man who is not entirely sure he's allowed to be somewhere, but has decided to be there anyway. He saw her over the wall and lifted a hand. She lifted hers in return. "The gate was unlocked," he called. "I thought someone ought to water the beds before everything goes to seed." Miss Marple looked at him for a moment, at his good-natured, unfinished face, at the trowel held with the slight awkwardness of someone who has not entirely found his relationship with gardening yet, but is working at it with reasonable goodwill. "Yes," she said, "I think that's quite right." He went in through the gate and began, with visible uncertainty but genuine effort, to move between the plots. She watched him for a little while, saw him pause at plot 9 and look at the daffodils, and then carefully, with a courtesy she found unexpectedly moving, Take the watering can from Harold Cross's shed and begin to water the shallots." She did not call out anything further. There was nothing further that needed to be said. She turned back to Joan's garden and continued her examination of the frost damage, moving slowly along the beds with her one gentle finger lifting leaves, her eyes doing what they always did, finding what was there, naming it accurately, neither catastrophizing nor dismissing, simply attending to the truth of what grew and what had not survived, and what, with a little care and patience, might yet be recovered. This was, she had always thought, the proper work of a gardener, and of a detective for that matter, and of anyone who wished to understand the world as it actually was rather than as it conveniently appeared to be. The April sun came through the gap between the church and the rectory at 8:15, and lay along the top of the wall in a long warm stripe, and the garden smelled of cold earth and wallflowers, and somewhere in the churchyard the wood-pigeon began again its four-note inquiry, impatient and hopeful. Joan appeared at the kitchen door. "Breakfast," she said. "Yes," said Miss Marple, pulling off her gardening gloves, "in just a moment." She looked at the garden one last time, at the things that had survived the frost and the things that had not, at the wallflowers burning orange and gold against the old stone, at the alliums pressing upward out of the dark earth with their particular quiet insistence. Then she went inside, where it was warm, and where the tea was ready, and where the morning was ordinary and good. And so ends Murder in the Allotment Garden, a Miss Marple mystery. Dear friends, thank you for gathering with us this evening. Wherever in this wide world you find yourselves, do leave us a note in the comments. We read every one. And there is nothing quite like knowing who has been sitting with us through the story. We shall meet again very soon for another quiet mystery, told without hurry, just for you. Until then, good night and good rest. Edward.